The radar scope pulsed with empty promise. A cold green glow painted across the screens, but nothing moved. No pings, no tracks, no threats. Yet they were out there. Captain Andrei Morozov of the 134th Soviet SAM Battalion squinted into the silence of his radar bunker, buried beneath reinforced concrete in East Germany. Moments earlier, the sky had been alive with targets, dozens of blips streaking toward Warsaw-packed airspace at Mach speeds. Now, they were gone. Not shot down, not turned around. Just invisible. Morozov barked at his technicians. Reboot the fan-song radar. Cycle the power to the Clion guidance system. Check the voltmeters. The Soviet air defense web prized across the Eastern Bloc, built on layers of overlapping missile coverage, had gone blind. It was impossible. This was no backwater battery. This was one of the USSR's premier anti-air zones, fortified with SA-2 guideline launchers, SA-6 gainful units, and a web of early warning radar designed to track even NATO's fastest bombers. It had been tested, calibrated, and praised by party officials, and now it was useless. Miles away, flying just above the treetops at 480 knots, a U.S. F-4G, Wild Weasel, crept through the electromagnetic wreckage it had just created. In its belly, an arsenal of anti-radiation missiles. On its wingtips, powerful electronic countermeasure pods, spewing high-frequency jamming into the ether, scattering radar waves into chaos. And overhead, somewhere even higher, a formation of strike fighters was moving in undetected. The Americans hadn't fired a shot yet. They didn't have to. The air defense system, once thought to be a steel curtain, was now a silent graveyard of spinning antennas and empty screens. Decades earlier, Soviet engineers had warned, a radar without eyes is no better than a blind sniper. But few had listened. They believed in metal, in missiles, in radar, in doctrine, and they never expected that their greatest vulnerability would come not from stealth or speed, but from invisible waves of noise. The ECM wave had begun, and with it, a new kind of war. In the war rooms of Moscow, the air defense doctrine was written in steel and certainty. SAMs didn't fail, radar didn't lie, and enemy aircraft, no matter how fast, how low, or how advanced, could not penetrate the Soviet Union's layered shield of surface-to-air missiles. The logic was simple. A network of overlapping missile zones, fed by radar eyes and linked through command bunkers, would form an impenetrable dome. It had worked before, most famously in 1960, when an SA-2 guideline brought down Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane. That single shot confirmed a belief that became doctrine. The Soviet SAM network was the ultimate equalizer. There was no room for uncertainty. In the 1,970 seconds, Soviet officers grew confident, even arrogant. They believed they had rendered strategic bombing obsolete. Their missile crews trained relentlessly. Newer systems like the SA-3 Goa and SA-6 Gainful were introduced, with mobile launchers, better tracking, and denser coverage. Each radar station had redundant frequencies. Each missile battalion had overlapping zones. The entire concept was rooted in control. If a pilot dared cross the line, he would be seen, tracked, and destroyed before reaching his target. Aircraft were nothing but fleeting ghosts. The radars were the exorcists. Soviet air defense became a temple complex, hierarchical and unwavering. And yet, there were whispers. Reports from the Middle East trickled in. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, Israeli pilots flying American-built jets with early ECM pods had survived longer than they should have. Some Soviet advisors dismissed it as Israeli luck. Others blamed Egyptian miscalculation. Then came Vietnam. American aircraft, jamming equipment installed on their underbellies, began to evade radar locks. Pilots spoke of flying through corridors of static, zones where SA-2 sights fired blindly into the clouds. Strike packages survived against all odds. But the reports were fragmented, inconsistent, and crucially unwelcome in Soviet briefings. After all, electronic warfare wasn't a Soviet weapon. It wasn't kinetic. It wasn't glorious. There were no medals for jamming, no statues for interference. Only engineers working in labs, and pilots trusting invisible shields they couldn't see. So the Soviet High Command chose belief over adaptation. Their radar couldn't be blinded. Their frequencies couldn't be jammed. Their missiles couldn't be spoofed. Because if that were true, if electromagnetic interference could silence a billion-dollar defense grid, then everything the Soviet Union had built in the sky was a lie, and that they simply refused to consider. To the Soviet military mind, war was geometry. Defense zones were arranged like overlapping rings. Every SAM had a radar, every radar a target arc, every arc a blind spot accounted for in advance. Redundancy wasn't a flaw, it was strategy. And in the Soviet doctrine of Integrated Air Defense Systems, IADS, control was everything. The battlefield was a grid, the sky a box. Within this framework, electronic countermeasures ECM were considered a secondary nuisance. Soviet planners acknowledged that jamming existed, of course, but they assumed that brute force radar, hardened frequency hopping, and sheer saturation would neutralize any attempt at interference. If an enemy jammed a radar, another would take over. If a signal was distorted, the analog filters would recover it. At the doctrinal level, ECM was treated like a bug, not a feature, something to be swatted, not feared. Their faith lay in density. Hundreds of radar arrays, dozens of overlapping missile systems, a chain of command that could relay track data across vast distances. This belief ran deep. Soviet SAM officers were trained to rotate frequencies, shift antennas, and even fire missiles on predicted target vectors if jamming was suspected. But all of this assumed one thing, that jamming was local, limited, and reactive. What the Soviets failed to understand, what would ultimately shatter their doctrine, was that the Americans didn't view ECM as a defensive tactic. They saw it as an offensive weapon. While Soviet engineers built bigger radars, the U.S. was designing systems that could blind them before a missile ever launched. Electronic warfare crews didn't fly behind bombers, they led the charge. They mapped the electromagnetic spectrum, seeded confusion, created false tracks, and wiped radar scopes clean with carefully timed bursts of energy. This wasn't noise. This was electromagnetic warfare. Platforms like the EF-111A Raven and EA-6B Prowler weren't there to survive. They were there to dominate the airspace before the first bomb fell. They didn't just jam signals, they synchronized jamming with SEAD strikes, using anti-radiation missiles to kill radars the moment they revealed themselves. It was a doctrine shift the Soviets never anticipated, from static defense to dynamic denial, from analog resilience to digital deception, from radar coverage to radar vulnerability. And yet, the Soviet command structure remained anchored to its belief that visibility equaled control, and that missiles only missed because of poor training, not because the target had vanished in a haze of electronic chaos. The doctrine didn't break all at once. It cracked slowly, frequency by frequency, radar by radar, until one day, the grid that had promised invincibility was no longer a shield, but a trap. The first true shock came not in Europe, but in Southeast Asia. It was 1967, and deep inside North Vietnam, Soviet-supplied SA-2 guideline missile crews had become confident, some would say arrogant. For months, they had watched American bombers fall from the sky, their radar scopes lighting up with targets that couldn't run fast enough or dive low enough to escape, until one day, they did. It was a routine sortie on paper. U.S. strike aircraft were returning to bomb a suspected storage depot north of Hanoi. Soviet advisors monitored the Vietnamese crews from behind their radar consoles. The Fan Song guidance radar locked on the incoming wave. Everything was perfect. Then nothing. The radar screen fractured into bands of static. Target tracks split into three. then 4, then vanished. The signal strength dipped erratically, bouncing across the band. Operators recalibrated, changed frequencies, switched to backup channels. No change. The Americans were still coming. That much was clear. They could be heard over the communications intercepts, caught by lookouts, spotted visually. But the SAM batteries could not track them. Missiles launched anyway, blind. None hit. Instead, several minutes later, as the confusion grew, the true strike package arrived. F-4 Phantoms, screaming low and fast, wild weasels diving in to unleash AGM-45 Shrike missiles. The SAM site erupted in a geyser of flame as its radar broadcast gave away its position. It had been baited into revealing itself, then obliterated. Soviet officers on the ground were stunned. This wasn't jamming, it was tactical disappearance. What they witnessed was the early fruit of America's most radical Cold War shift. The marriage of ECM and suppression of enemy air defenses, SEAD. The F-105G Wild Weasel variants had been equipped with not only powerful jamming pods, but radar warning receivers and anti-radiation missiles that homed in on the very radar signals meant to track them. The idea was revolutionary. Use the enemy's eyes to blind him. It wasn't just electronic harassment anymore. This was information warfare in real time, decades before the term would become fashionable. The Soviets wrote reports. They submitted after-action memos. Many dismissed it as a one-time trick, a failure of Vietnamese training, or American luck. But those who knew better knew this was just the beginning. And in that moment, deep in the jungle, as radar scopes flickered and missiles streaked toward empty sky, Soviet air defense officers realized something had changed. For the first time in memory, the target was invisible. Back in Moscow, the initial reports from Vietnam caused discomfort but not alarm. The General Staff had seen battlefield anomalies before. Radar interference, ghost tracks, and temporary losses of lock were chalked up to tropical weather, rushed Vietnamese training, or even American propaganda. The idea that U.S. jets were intentionally disappearing from radar, using electronic waves, was considered speculative at best. To accept that premise would mean acknowledging that the Soviet Union's most sophisticated weapon, the anti-aircraft missile network it had exported across the Warsaw Pact and into client states, was not just vulnerable, but obsolete under certain conditions. And that was unthinkable. Instead, Soviet analysts at the Central Air Defense Directorate drafted new theories. They suggested that malfunctioning components were to blame, maintenance irregularities, overloaded transmitters, interference from civilian broadcast signals. One internal briefing even hypothesized that local atmospheric anomalies, combined with terrain diffraction, had caused the fan-song radar to scatter its signal. They treated it like a hardware issue, but it wasn't. What Moscow couldn't see, what it refused to see, was that these failures were no accident. They were designed outcomes, the deliberate result of U.S. jamming platforms coordinated with surgical airstrikes. The ECM wasn't a byproduct, it was the first wave of the assault. Still, the USSR doubled down on confidence. They flooded their satellite allies with more hardware, SA-3 Goa batteries with faster engagement times, improved radar arrays with rotating frequencies, operators trained in electronic countermeasures, ECCM, meant to filter out jamming signals. But it wasn't enough. Because the Americans had moved on from mere jamming, they were scripting the electromagnetic battle space, deciding when radars would fail, which systems would activate, and which operators would be too confused to fire. Yet the Kremlin, guided by pride and precedent, dismissed these reports as battlefield noise. They cited historical proof: the U-2 shootdown in 1960, the successful tracking of Israeli and Turkish jets in peacetime, the vast inventory of radar systems blanketing Eastern Europe. How could such an overwhelming grid be defeated by static? They couldn't believe it. They wouldn't. And so, in meeting after meeting, Soviet generals stared at radar performance charts, pointed to missile inventories, and said what they'd always said: the network is secure, the targets will be seen, the missiles will fire. But in truth, the ECM wave had already passed through them, and the enemy was already gone. The failure to see the battlefield clearly didn't just affect Soviet operators in the field, it corrupted Moscow's analytical response. Rather than acknowledge a fundamental doctrinal flaw, Soviet planners reached for a more comfortable explanation. Technical error. They called it localized radar desynchronization, a phrase that sounded authoritative, precise, harmless. Briefings circulated through the Air Defense Command, claiming the sudden blind spots experienced by SAM crews were not the result of American jamming, but rather signal confusion caused by improperly tuned components. Perhaps the Vietnamese didn't rotate radar frequencies fast enough. Maybe the semiconductors in their guidance systems were defective. Maybe the terrain masked echoes. The logic was simple. If the system failed, it must be because the system was not Soviet enough. They decided the problem wasn't the doctrine, it was the operators. The solution? Double down. Reinforce radar outposts with technical specialists. Ship in hardened amplifiers. Issue protocols for more aggressive signal switching during suspected interference. But none of it addressed the root cause. Because the Americans weren't interfering with Soviet systems by accident, they were doing it with surgical precision. They knew the frequency ranges of fan-song radars. They understood the pulse repetition frequency, PRF, patterns. And their ECM platforms like the EF111A Raven were designed specifically to exploit those parameters, introducing false returns, delayed echoes, and outright signal suppression. Still, Soviet planners clung to their wrong theory. They believed that building more radar would fix the problem. So they blanketed the airspace with overlapping search radars, upgraded missile guidance units, created redundancy upon redundancy, thinking that sheer mass would overcome disruption. But quantity could not outmaneuver intelligence. And every new installation, every new radar frequency, was simply added to a growing database inside American electronic warfare centers. The U.S. didn't have to guess anymore. They had learned the entire Soviet playbook, and they were rewriting the electromagnetic spectrum in real time. Meanwhile, the Soviets were fighting the last war with more iron, more antennas, and more certainty than ever before. It was a fatal misreading of the battlefield. They thought they were defending against faulty signals, but in reality, they were being outmaneuvered in a dimension they couldn't see. A battlefield where bullets didn't fly, but data did. When the first theory, technical malfunction, failed to explain the growing number of radar collapses and missed intercepts, Soviet planners reached for a second explanation: stealth. If it wasn't sabotage or system error, then it had to be the aircraft themselves. The Americans must have developed some sort of exotic cloaking technology, something beyond radar jamming. Some theorists suggested they were employing plasma shields to bend radar waves. Others believed in more fantastical concepts: airborne mirrors, blackbody suppression, even radar-eating coatings. By the late 1970s, the term stealth had entered Soviet lexicon not as a niche research topic, but as a mythical catch-all, invoked to explain the inexplicable. And in a way, it was half true. America was indeed developing stealth platforms. The F-117 Nighthawk was already flying in secret by 1981, but the aircraft blinding Soviet radars in Vietnam, Lebanon, and later over Libya were not stealth. They were conventional fighters, aided by ECM systems and real-time battlefield coordination. What the Soviets misunderstood was that ECM didn't need to make the aircraft invisible. It only needed to make the radar doubt itself. By injecting false returns, simulating phantom aircraft, or flooding systems with white noise, U.S. ECM crews could disrupt the decision loop of SAM operators. If a radar saw 5 targets and 4 were fake, the operator would hesitate. If the radar showed a missile incoming from one vector while the actual aircraft approached from another, the sight would miss entirely. But Soviet analysts, unwilling to admit that the enemy had outthought them in electronic warfare, focused obsessively on stealth technology. They began retrofitting radar systems for ultra-low frequency detection, theorizing it could catch invisible planes. Some advocated for optical tracking systems and passive infrared detection. A few even suggested returning to acoustic listening devices, a concept discarded decades earlier. None of it worked. The enemy wasn't hiding from radar. They were controlling it. And still, Soviet doctrine continued to chase shadows. Resources were allocated to anti-stealth research. The design bureaus scrambled to develop counter-stealth SAMs, new radar geometries, and multispectral sensors. In doing so, they poured precious effort into solving a problem that wasn't even the real threat. They were preparing for war against invisible planes, when the real danger came from visible planes wrapped in invisible noise. The misdirection was perfect, and by the time the Soviets realized they were targeting the wrong ghost, the ECM wave had already passed. By the early 1980 seconds, the evidence had become overwhelming. Soviet-made radar systems were failing in the field not once, not occasionally, but repeatedly and systematically. From the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon to Iranian missile belts crippled by U.S.-backed strikes, Soviet-supplied SAM crews were encountering what they could only describe as a force field of silence. Radar screens filled with ghost returns, lock-on reticles froze mid-sweep, and missile salvos vanished into the sky without hitting a single target. Reports flooded in from across the globe. Libyan SA. 5 batteries went blind during U.S. strikes in 1986. Iraqi radar operators in the Iran-Iraq War reported phantom squadrons they could never find. East German observers noted U.S. training flights slipping through radar corridors with unexplainable ease. The Soviet Union had access to all of it, but the analysis never connected the dots. Why? Because Soviet intelligence was siloed. Technicians, signal analysts, and doctrine officers worked in parallel, but not in coordination. Each unit interpreted the failures through its own lens. One team blamed operator fatigue. Another suggested Western disinformation. A third concluded that sabotage must be at play. No one in Moscow was willing to synthesize the real picture, that the West had developed an integrated, offensive ECM doctrine that could disarm even the most saturated Soviet air defense zones. There were opportunities, critical ones, to course-correct. Captured jamming pods, recorded interference patterns, debriefings from Warsaw Pact crews who had seen their equipment fail firsthand. But these were filtered, diluted, or outright ignored by a leadership obsessed with maintaining the illusion of superiority. The system wasn't built to self-correct. It was built to self-affirm. Even when American publications began openly discussing electronic warfare concepts in trade journals by the mid-1980 seconds, Soviet analysts dismissed them as exaggerations, propaganda, psychological warfare. Surely, no military would lead with jammers. Surely, missiles still ruled the sky. But the Americans weren't just theorizing, they were training. U.S. red flag exercises were built around ECM suppression. SEAD teams coordinated with naval jammers and airborne command posts. Radar jamming was choreographed like a ballet. Every frequency mapped, every pulse calculated, every emission a weapon. And still, Soviet intelligence failed to grasp the scale of the transformation. They didn't realize the Americans had shifted the battlefield from the physical to the electromagnetic, not until it was too late, not until Operation Desert Storm, not until an entire generation of Soviet-made SAM systems in Iraqi hands were switched on, targeted, and destroyed without ever seeing what hit them. It was the most catastrophic intelligence failure of the Soviet air defense program, because the one thing they were supposed to control, the sky, had been taken. Without a single dogfight, what the Soviets never grasped, what they systematically refused to believe, was that the Americans had redefined the battlefield, not with stealth, not with numbers, but with information dominance. At the heart of this revolution was a simple principle. Whoever controls the electromagnetic spectrum controls the war. While the Soviet Union doubled down on bigger radars, denser missile belts, faster interceptors, the United States began training a new kind of warrior, the electronic combat specialist. These weren't just pilots, they were signal architects, designing battles before the first missile was ever fired. By the mid-1980s, this system had matured into a triad. ECM platforms like the EF-111A Raven and EA-6B Prowler, which could jam, spoof, and confuse entire radar grids. SEAD aircraft like the F-4G Wild Weasel, which carried AGM-88 HARM missiles that hunted down enemy emitters. Command and control systems like the EC-130H Compass Call and E-3 AWACS, which orchestrated the entire electromagnetic ballet in real time. This was not passive defense. It was preemptive suppression. Every mission began with signal mapping. Satellites recorded radar positions. AWACS aircraft tracked shifts in SAM deployment. Jamming algorithms were uploaded into pods before takeoff, precisely tuned to match the expected frequencies. When the strike began, the American system didn't simply dodge radar, it turned it into a liability. Here's how it worked. First, ECM aircraft flew ahead of the main force, flooding the radar bands with interference. Soviet systems designed to track clear targets began chasing noise. Operators saw dozens of false returns. Their screens lit up with impossible vectors. Then, the SEAD crews moved in. Wild Weasels baited radar sites to activate. The moment a SAM crew turned on its emitter, the aircraft launched a HARM missile that homed in on the signal source. The result? A self-destructing defense grid. The more the Soviets tried to fight, the more they revealed themselves and the faster they were destroyed. Meanwhile, the true strike package, F-15 seconds, F-16 seconds. Bombers flew behind this electromagnetic fog of war, almost unopposed. The genius of the system was that it didn't rely on any single weapon. It was a networked kill chain, each platform supporting the next. If a radar survived jamming, it faced a harm. If it dodged the harm, it was mapped and scheduled for destruction by conventional airstrikes. Every Soviet countermeasure had already been studied, tested, and defeated before it ever entered combat. And during Operation Desert Storm, this system reached its apex. In the opening hours of the war, over 1,000 sorties were flown in the first 24 hours. SAM sites across Iraq built on Soviet designs vanished from the battle map. Missiles fired blindly. Radar crews shut down systems to avoid detection. Entire air defense sectors were blinded within minutes. American losses? Minimal. Soviet-designed SAMs, once thought invincible, were reduced to irrelevant hardware, powerful in theory, impotent in practice. And Moscow watched, in silence, as decades of doctrine crumbled under the weight of one unbearable truth. The Americans hadn't outbuilt them. They had outthought them. The 17th of January, 1991. The night sky above Baghdad was filled with the unmistakable growl of turbojet engines and the faint electronic pulse of systems far beyond Iraqi comprehension. It was the opening salvo of Operation Desert Storm, and the night Soviet air defense doctrine was publicly dismantled. Iraqi radar crews, trained by Soviet advisors and equipped with a vast arsenal of SA-2, SA-3, and SA-6 SAMs, awaited the American attack with confidence. Their coverage was thick. The radar net had multiple redundancies. The missiles were loaded and armed. They expected a traditional airstrike. What they got was a masterclass in electromagnetic warfare. First, EA-6B Prowlers and EF-111A Ravens opened the corridor with wideband jamming. Radar screens across Baghdad lit up with ghosts. Some Iraqi operators saw 20 incoming targets. Others saw none. No two screens told the same story. In desperation, SAM crews activated their search radars just in time to receive the kiss of death. AGM-88 HARM missiles, launched by F-4G Wild Weasels, followed the emissions back to their source. Dozens of radar sites lit up for mere seconds before vanishing in a fiery cascade. The very act of seeing had become a death sentence. And then the bombs began to fall. F-117 Nighthawks, flying under the cloak of stealth and electronic suppression, bypassed what was left of the radar grid. Their precision-guided munitions struck command bunkers, communication centers, and hardened missile shelters. Not a single F-117 was lost. Meanwhile, conventional strike aircraft F-15S, F-16 seconds, and B-52 seconds flew routes cleared by ECM and SEAD units. Even the legendary Soviet SA-5 systems, designed to destroy high-altitude targets, never fired a meaningful shot. The few that did were blind launches, fired into darkness and noise. In total, the Americans flew over 100,000 sorties. The majority encountered no functional radar opposition. The most humiliating moment came when an Iraqi SA-6 battery launched a full volley at incoming U.S. aircraft guided by the assumption that their radar was jammed, not destroyed. The missiles rose, then curved away, then detonated harmlessly, fooled by electronic decoys and confused by falsified trajectories. The Soviet-style integrated air defense system, designed to repel NATO's best, had been rendered irrelevant in a single night. And the world watched. The footage aired live. CNN broadcast the eerie quiet of Baghdad's skies. Pilots returned to base almost bored. In war rooms across the Soviet Union, analysts stared at maps that showed radar silence where coverage should have been. For decades, the Soviets had promised their allies a shield, a grid, a wall of radar-guided steel. That night, America didn't go around the wall. It erased it. The humiliation wasn't just in the loss. It was in the ease of it. This wasn't attrition. It wasn't brute force. It was a lesson in supremacy. Control the spectrum, and you control the war. The defeat was not just tactical. It was existential. In the aftermath of Desert Storm, as burned-out radar trailers littered the deserts of Iraq, and declassified reports filtered back into the Eastern Bloc, a chilling realization spread through Soviet military circles. Their integrated air defense system praised, exported, and idolized had failed completely. For decades, the Soviets believed that massed air defenses were the ultimate deterrent. The entire Eastern military doctrine had been built on denying Western air power access to critical zones. But now, every assumption was shattered. The Americans had not only destroyed SAM sites, they had done so with no attrition, bypassing layers of overlapping systems designed to bleed any attacker. This triggered a slow collapse inside the Soviet defense apparatus. At the strategic level, faith in deterrence was gone. What good was a missile shield if it could be blinded with a switch? What use was doctrine if it collapsed under a single application of coordinated jamming and strike? Senior officers began quietly admitting the truth. They had underestimated information warfare, not just in ECM, but in signal intelligence, real-time battlefield coordination, and the seamless integration of airborne command assets like AWACS with tactical strike teams. At the ideological level, the blow cut deeper. The Soviet Union had always defined its strength by its engineering, the sheer power of its tanks, its missiles, its rockets, and yes, its radar. The IADS was a technological monument to central planning, to control, to the idea that war could be managed like a system. But war had changed. America had weaponized chaos. They had made invisibility tactical. They had embraced agility over redundancy, flexibility over hierarchy, networks over nodes. And, worst of all, they had proven it on live television. The ideological foundations of the Soviet air doctrine, order, scale, predictability, were obsolete in a world where seconds of confusion meant total defeat. There were no reforms that could save the old way. The entire system would need to be rebuilt from scratch if the Soviet Union survived long enough to try. But it didn't. Months after the desert skies over Baghdad had turned silent, the empire collapsed. The Warsaw Pact dissolved, and the radar stations went dark, not from jamming, but from irrelevance. Today, Remnants of the Soviet IA days rot quietly in the deserts of the Middle East, overgrown and outmoded. Some lie rusting outside of Baghdad. Others are staged in military museums, their once feared missiles now nothing more than silent exhibits behind cracked glass. But for the few who remember, the lessons of that war linger like radiation. In the skies above, the battle space has only grown more abstract. Invisible waves now determine victory before a trigger is ever pulled. Jamming, spoofing, cyber attacks, satellite uplinks, this is the new air power. And its first true proof wasn't in Silicon Valley or in DARPA labs. It was on radar scopes across the Soviet Empire, glowing with lies before going dark forever. Today's adversaries chase that American mastery of the spectrum. Russia scrambles to modernize its SAM systems, branding new S-400 batteries as unbeatable. China builds its own networked IADS, cloaking radar sites in mountain ranges and false signals. But the ghost still haunts them, because they remember. They remember the night their radars screamed false warnings. They remember missiles launched at shadows. They remember command posts silenced by signals they couldn't trace. And above all, they remember this. The most terrifying weapon of the Cold War wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a stealth jet. It wasn't even a missile. It was the sound of nothing. A battlefield gone quiet. A screen gone blank. And an enemy that vanished before the war even began.